Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 387 of CryptoBiography, and it's a story called The Cemetery Next Door. And here we go. She liked spending hours in the cemetery by her house. It wasn't particularly large or particularly old, but it was quiet. Of course, it is almost always quiet in a cemetery, but in this case it was dead quiet. The cemetery had been filled about 25 years ago, nearly a decade before she was born. Since then, it had coasted on its maintenance fund. Her interest in the cemetery had taught her how they worked. As people buy plots and pay for burials, the money goes into a fund. The fund pays for the maintenance, which is mostly taxes and groundskeeping. A properly run cemetery can take its funds and pay for the maintenance of the grounds indefinitely on interest. In the case of her favorite cemetery, it was clear that the fund had been somehow mismanaged. It was not, as far as she'd been able to determine, taken over by the local municipality, as sometimes happens, but neither was it being properly maintained. Instead of well-manicured lawns and grounds, the grass grew quite high before it was cut at all, and when it was almost never properly edged. So all around the headstones, there were taller grasses and other plants creeping up around them like green, grasping fingers. She could tell when a headstone had been visited because the visitors usually pulled the weeds away from the headstone in a small act of reverence. She wandered the gravestones, looking at old names and years. Over time, she started to remember more and more of them, particularly if she liked the name or found the headstone memorable in some way. Juliet Van Horn, 1911 to 1992. John Poss, 1897 to 1969. She'd never heard of the name Poss before, but she liked it. Marcy Belling, 1992 to 1999. So young, and one of the last to be buried here. Most of the children's headstones were from the time before vaccines. The cemetery had started in the 20s, so that era had faded out a few decades after it had opened. Marcy, having died at the age of 7 in the 90s, was a rarity. Sometimes she wondered what had happened to Marcy, perhaps a car accident or a household accident of some kind. She stayed there for hours, whenever the weather allowed. Hardly anyone came there anymore. It was open to the public, but few visited. She thought this was a shame, as 25 years was a fairly long time, especially to a teenager, but it wasn't so long that no one should remember these people and visit their graves occasionally. She felt especially for those who had been buried sometime in the 1990s, who must have living relatives. She felt for Marcy Belling especially. She looked her up, but there wasn't anything. Not too surprising. Marcy had been young and had died before the advent of smartphones and the personal data explosion they represented. On the rare occasions that anyone came and visited a grave, she stayed well out of sight. She assumed most people would think she was a fellow mourner of some kind, and even if they saw her reading a book, as she often did there, it would be by the grave of someone she was related to. But still, she didn't feel comfortable, so she always wandered away when someone happened to visit her cemetery, as she increasingly thought of it. One day, looking again at Marcy Belling's gravestone with its little flower design above the name, she decided that she couldn't just passively take in the ambiance of the cemetery any longer. She looked up a guide, remarkable what people will post to YouTube, and took a simple biodegradable cleanser and a bucket and water and a few sponges and so on, and started cleaning the headstones. The older ones needed it most, of course, but she started with Marcy Belling's. She did it carefully, in case she was doing something wrong, but it seemed to go well. She also pulled the grasses away from the base of her headstone so that the moss and mold wouldn't grow back so quickly. She did that by hand, so it was a little rough, but it did the job. Then she went through the cemetery. The cleaning became part of her time there. Though she sometimes just visited as she did before, most of the time she brought her supplies and cleaned up at least 1 or 2 headstones. The older ones were more difficult, of course, and the ones in the shade had a lot more filth on them. but she just did them one by one. She was working on Clarice Morganson, 1871 to 1944, when someone said, "Thanks." She looked up. There was an older woman there, watching her clean. "Sorry?" "Thanks for cleaning the headstones. I think you're the only one who does it. I would join you, but my arthritis..." She faded off and looked at her hands, which were curled up into claws. "Oh, my pleasure," she said. "It relaxes me, and I just think about these people and who they might have been." The woman nodded, apparently understanding what she was getting at. "I have a few relatives here. You've cleaned one of their headstones already, Thomas Park, over there," she pointed. The name seemed familiar, though it wasn't one of the ones that stuck in her mind. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, a little by rote. "It was a long time ago. He was my brother, and though he was just in his 20s, he got cancer." She let the sentence drop on the word. "Oh, awful," she replied. "I was sorry that the cemetery closed up," the woman picked up. "After Tommy was buried here, I thought about getting a plot, but I never did, and then they were all sold out. Even though a couple of my less close relatives were also buried here, long after Tommy was, I just didn't do it. And now it's too late. I still like it, though. I like it, too. Well, whatever your reasons for cleaning the headstones, thank you." "My pleasure. I don't live too close any longer. I only get here a couple of times a year, so I might not see you again. But I just wanted you to know that someone appreciates what you're doing." The woman turned and, without saying another word, wandered away, probably to visit the grave of one of her relatives. This was the only time she ever got thanked, but she never forgot it, and a couple of years later, when she went to college in another state, she wondered if anyone would take care of the gravestones in her absence. And she wondered if the woman, Tommy Park's sister, was still alive to visit, and if she knew that she couldn't clean them any longer, but would if she still lived nearby. And she wondered if anyone ever visited the grave of Marcy Belling, who died so young, on the cusp of a new decade, new century, and new millennium. And that's the story. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or X or Mastodon. And I will probably get Blue Sky going pretty soon, but I haven't gotten that one done yet. But anyway, thank you for listening. Words and music, copyright 2024, Brandon Starr, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.